only other thing that I would add to that nice introduction is that I'm actually really not a Taiwan scholar. So I do a lot of work on China and have kind of spent my life trying to figure out the economic reforms there and developed a lot of views on what's actually happening in China. And occasionally I do get drawn into conversations about Taiwan, but it's, I sort of view myself larger as a China scholar and scholar of the Chinese economy. And so when I was asked to come talk about this, I laid the groundwork for that caveat, but I was told that this group actually likes to have a diverse set of conversations about things, and I actually do have some very clear opinions on certain things that I think are relevant for the relationship between Taiwan and China. And so what I'd like to do is, as we're going through this, I'm going to mostly set up what my views are for the Greater China area on embedding this a little bit in my work on China's economic reforms, and then draw up what the implications are of that for the Taiwan issues. So the first thing that I would just like to say, that some of this stuff is discussed in a series of books that I have, sort of seems like the oldest new book project I've ever had, because it just keeps being the same book that comes out year in, year out. Probably it's on the third or fourth edition at this point. But it's allowed me to actually think about these issues in kind of a broader audience and step away from the more technical academic issues that have dominated a lot of my career. Now, so as I said, I'm going to start off by just talking a little bit about China and what my views are on China and what really drives the economic development in China, and then think about what that actually means for the Taiwan question. So this is a story that everybody at this point knows very well. We read about it in the press ad nauseum. It's, we know that this story of this country, the massive population that was on the verge of bankruptcy in 1978, somehow rose from the ashes and became the second largest economy in the world, and sometime around 2016 or 2017, barring some kind of catastrophic thing or barring Gordon Chang being right all along, we're going to see China become the largest economy in the world. And that, in some sense, is an inevitability that has been explained in a variety of different ways. People have talked about it being the result of a deep, cheap labor pool. People have talked about it being the result of currency manipulation. But the numbers don't lie at this point. I think we're pretty clear that this is actually what is going to happen. And of course, these aren't just about numbers. These are about what the true feel of this entire environment is. It's about the fact that, as a graduate student, I can stand at this vantage point in the early 1990s and look out across the Hu River and basically just see that TV tower and a bunch of broken down factories and some rice fields. And today it is a science fiction-esque, futuristic landscape that actually has completely transformed how we understand the process of economic development. It's truly a remarkable economic development story. There are so many different ways to actually think about how you view China, many lenses, many vantage points, from the Western encroachment in the late Ming period to the rise of the guerrilla warrior who led China to kick the foreign devils out, to now the sort of kitschy version of Mao that blesses everything that's capitalist today. But of course, this story from Images really starts in 1979. It starts with the moment in which two key things happen, and the second of those being a really key thing that defined U.S.-Taiwan relations. So the first thing that happens, of course, is Deng Xiaoping comes into power, and Deng Xiaoping was the ultimate pragmatist. We can forget about communism at this point. This is an authoritarian leader with a history of favoritism towards capitalism, but he didn't really care about much, other than China being great. He often said, I don't care if the cat is black or white as long as it catches mice. And that mouse is global capitalism. That ability to actually be great has to do with where China was going to go in the future. And he comes over and he visits 3 cities in addition to Washington and really thinks deeply about what those issues are from a symbolic perspective, but also a practical perspective going forward. He goes to Seattle because he wants to visit Boeing and see what high-tech manufacturing looks like. He goes to Atlanta because he wants to see what a truly dominant global consumer company is in Coca-Cola. And of course he goes to Houston because he knows that if China is truly going to be great, they better be launching rockets in 20 or 30 years, which they did. But you can really sort of see the prescience of this guy that was still running around in Mao suits and still looked like a communist at heart. He was truly a remarkable leader, if authoritarian for sure, but he was a remarkable individual in terms of what he saw as the future of China. Now, of course, right along with this moment, you have these parallel things happening because you have Jimmy Carter signing the Normalization Act, and then you have Congress passing the Taiwan Relations Act, right? And so you have this dynamic, this tension that's set up between these three countries or these three areas, these three geopolitical units that we still see to some extent today, although I would argue, and I'd love to hear much more from you, but by the time we get to the question and answer, my view is that a lot of those issues have gone away for a very specific strategic reason that China has really emphasized, for better or for worse. Now, of course, the big moment changes at this point in time, right? Most people don't remember this picture as well as they remember the Deng Xiaoping and Jimmy Carter picture because we had other things on our mind in this September 18th, 2001. This country was rocked with a whole variety of other things that we were worried about, and so China's accession to the WTO happened relatively quietly. But this was a moment, if you were a China scholar, you started to see the world quake from a business perspective. It was also, if you remember correctly, a very interesting year in terms of what the relationship between China and the United States was playing up to be. So in spring of 2001, George Bush made the gaffe of saying we would defend Taiwan if Beijing invaded, which sounded reasonable enough, but then you had Colin Powell on Good Morning America saying, oh, he didn't mean that, he doesn't really actually understand the policy, he doesn't understand the implications. But it looked very much like George Bush really was setting China up to be the new Cold War foe. We needed a new enemy if the military-industrial complex was going to proceed in the favorable ways that it had. And then, of course, September 11th happened and the world changed in dramatic ways, and this kind of tension went away. But what actually happened is that something that had begun a decade earlier in terms of China's strategic approach to how to deal with the Taiwan question or the Taiwan problem through economics would continue and it would pick up speed. And so I think this moment is a really important stepping stone in sort of a 20-year process in which the issue has really been subsumed under economics. And of course, the greatest coming out party we've ever seen happens in 2008, and the world is joyous and thinking about how great things are going in Asia. But maybe not. This is still, interestingly enough today, just something every year there seems to be a new voice that is talking about, as Gordon Chang put it, the coming collapse of China. Of course, he predicted China would for sure collapse in 10 years, so 2011 was his date, and then he just has been all over the airwaves recently saying, well, I was wrong about 2011, but it's 2013 for sure. And, I don't know how much you want to make of what he has to say, but he's one of these people that believes China is fundamentally corrupt, corruption is endemic, and it's a horrible situation. But you have other areas that are looking at this. Of course, James Chanos became very famous over the last two years because he's talking about shorting China because of the real estate bubble. Every year there's sort of somebody new who's really talking about what this picture looks like. And it's not only because of the economics of the situation. Of course, trade issues drive a lot of this, but there's also tremendous concern about the environmental degradation and the waste, the terrible poverty that still exists. Of course, the political tensions that still define our understanding of China for images going forward for decades. And of course, the silliest debate of all, the currency manipulation one, which really has nothing to do with what is wrong with our economy today, but it seems very easy to blame China for everything that's wrong. But of course, we also have real things that are much more tangible, like human rights abuses, and even the Guo Xilai affair, which has really, in some ways, I think, reopened the question of just how endemic corruption is and just what it means for the princeling faction within the government. But what I like to do is sort of take a step back and say, let's set aside all of the images for a minute. Let's not really think about what we believe is in the popular media, because I think the popular media is a little bit nuts with respect to China these days. And so I think that really it's most interesting to take a step back and say, what do we know? What have we learned? And what is the reality of China's economic reforms, and how do we understand it? And then here again, what does it actually mean for other discussions? Now, in my general work, I tend to emphasize 6 things that are really crucial for understanding what I think is truly an innovative approach to economic reform. Gradualism, decentralization, an openness to foreign investment, governmental strategizing and cross-industry coordination, the balancing of public and private economies, and the quiet revolution of institutions. Now, the keys that I really want to emphasize today, although I'll touch on each of these, the first three, I think, really define what is different about China, and in particular, the third one, which really is a strategy about interdependence. If you look at one of the things that is so deeply embedded in China's political landscape, is it is the way that it creates economic interdependence in order to make political issues go away, or if not make them go away, make them allow them to have leverage within those relationships. And this has happened with Taiwan, but it's happened even more aggressively recently with the United States. So if you're ever wondering why China is not only buying our debt, but sitting on $3 trillion of foreign exchange reserves, it is, of course, about finances, but our debt isn't actually the best debt in the world anymore, and they continue to buy it, right? And the reason is because of the leverage it creates in the political relationship, right? And I would make the case that the same thing has happened with the Taiwan situation. So let me kind of run through each of these and just touch on them, and then talk a little bit about how I think this relates to the Taiwan situation. Now, one of the things that's interesting here is to think a little bit about what the economic reforms mean in China, because the economic reforms in China are not just about a deep, cheap labor pool. This has been presented this way since the 1990s, and the reason it's been presented this way is because China, as a case, has embarrassed many prominent economists around the world. The most prominent among them is Jeffrey Sachs, of course. Now, Jeffrey Sachs was the author of the Big Bang and shock therapy approach to economic reform that Russia went through. And he argued pretty simplistically throughout the late 1980s and 1990s that markets are pretty easy to create. You need to just get the government out of the way, privatize everything, and let the market do its magic. That wonderful story of the invisible hand, although I'm convinced that economists like Sachs, who I respect even much more than people like the late Milton Friedman, I'm convinced as much as these people cite the invisible hand that they never read past page 15 in Adam Smith, but that's another issue. But the key thing that's really interesting here is that this group of scholars were very, very aggressively arguing that you only needed a very simple set of prescriptions in order to set up a market economy. And it turns out that market institutions are incredibly complex to create. It's not just about creating the institutional infrastructure, all of the institutions that support a market economy, but it's also a cultural mindset that actually really guides what market economies are. Now, China has embarrassed a lot of these individuals because when China was roaring in the 1990s, and at 80s and 90s up until about 1996, China was double-digit growth for a decade and a half, which you never see in countries this large, right? You might see it in Botswana, but you're not going to see it in a country this large. And they argue, well, okay, so maybe we weren't quite right about how quick China would collapse and how fast Russia would take off, but that's because of a couple key things. One is that China was less industrialized and we didn't account for that. And two, they have a much deeper, cheaper labor pool. And so, of course, you can see the success, but guarantee you, just like Gordon Chang, we're predicting that this is all going to fall apart. It's a house of cards. Turns out it wasn't a house of cards. And actually, gradualist approaches to economic reform are exactly the opposite in theory from how the Big Bang or the Western-style approaches to building market institutions occur. And what I mean by that is that Western-style approaches to economic structure often come out of theory and are implemented from the theory. The gradualist model is much more experimental. The gradualist model actually begins with ideas and tests them out in the marketplace. Usually in China, they're tested out throughout the country at the 31 provincial level units and then on down in municipalities. You get a feedback loop going, and then eventually when you finally pass something, it's something that comes up much more organically. For people watching from the outside, it's a much more frustrating approach to how institutions are built, but the reality is I think that it actually tells you something about how social worlds build markets. So I think that's the first thing that's crucial there. The second thing that's crucial is to really deeply understand decentralization. Most people, when we worry or think about the policies that come out of Beijing, we act as if there is one China. There is not a China, right? There is this capital called Beijing, but part of the secret sauce of economic reforms in China has been the extent to which decentralization has driven local state competition, right? And this is actually how you get a successful market economy without privatization. Because as a footnote, the economists got it wrong in terms of what the key institution of capitalism is. The key institution of capitalism is not private property, it's competition. Right? We know many cases in our own country of firms that were private firms, publicly traded firms, that were woefully inefficient, just like state-owned organizations, because they operated in an oligopoly. Think about our auto industry. All right? So it has nothing to do with state ownership per se. What it has to do with is the level of competition and the level of innovation. You can have competition and innovation with or without private property, as long as you create the right competitive infrastructure within the market. So China was a very, very decentralized place from very early on, and it continues to be so today. And this actually is, I think, what is at the heart of some of the most exciting and dynamic aspects of China as a capitalist economy. The one thing that I always like to note here that it's really important to understand is just how important the second-tier cities are in China. So often when I talk to investors that want to know how to crack the China market, and I say, well, where are you going? What are you thinking? And you still, 30 years into this process, you hear the standard litany of Shanghai, Beijing, Guangzhou, maybe Hong Kong, but without realizing that actually most of the dynamic growth, and including the wealth growth in China, by the way, is happening in the second-tier and even third-tier cities. Places like Suzhou, Chengdu, these Xi'an, Dalian, these places are really where a lot of the action is, and you have this very dynamic public-private partnership that occurs at the state level that creates a whole lot of transformative value within the system. Now, of course, the comparison between China and the United States on where you have these kinds of dynamics allows you to understand why this economy is so much more dynamic than ours, but it's an important. Now, the third thing that I just like to emphasize is the ways in which partnerships and interdependence are driven through the process of foreign investment. Now, typically when we think about foreign investment in China, we think about three areas. We think about the goal of opening up markets, and so orientation towards the export market. We think about the transfer of technology, or put less nicely, the ripping off of IPR. And a third part of the way we think about this is the flow of managerial control, the diffusion of ideas, right? How to actually build a firm in a capitalist economy. The piece that's often missed is in many ways, I think, the most important piece, which is the creation of political interdependence. China is not the expansionist power that it's often portrayed to be. It does have very clear ideas on its sovereign rights as a nation, and that brings in the discussions about Taiwan and Tibet. But the reality is that in every one of these cases that we see where there's tensions, there is a tremendously powerful underlying agenda of building economic interdependence to mollify political problems. Right? And so that's, I just think, a crucial thing to think about here. Now, I'll just very quickly mention these other two and then jump into the discussion about Taiwan. I think it's incredibly important to remember just how important cross-industry strategizing is. You see a tremendous amount of this happening both in in China, but throughout East Asia. I'm actually an expert witness on a case right now that I just find to be an appalling case by the United States, but it's one that is really built on the idea of just how broad cross-industry strategizing is as a practice throughout all of East Asia. And so we can really see we're kind of mired in this country in a mindset in which we think very narrowly about how markets should be completely independent entities, and if any government involvement is in the mix, it's really inefficient because it's about regulation. And what we typically forget is that countries like Germany, South Korea, a lot of East Asia, and even our own country in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s were built on cross-industry strategy and coordination. And it just boggles my mind today of how negative we think about these issues in the United States. Now, the final thing, I missed one in here, but I must have pulled it out as a slide. But I think it's important also to think not just about the public-private partnerships, which I think was my fifth point, and then the sixth point is really thinking about the fact that there is actually a quiet institutional revolution that's happening in China today. So when we think of China as being this authoritarian government in which the oligarchs are all corrupt and holding on to power, we miss a lot of the groundwork that is being laid about an institutional transformation in China. Now, I will note one caveat here that I get more and more nervous about every day. I've been a big advocate of it, acknowledging how much transformation is going on in China and that China will be is headed towards a democracy and will be a democracy one day, and I think the evidence for that in the 90s and early 2000s was very clear. But it was clear for one reason. It was because Zhu Rongji was the greatest technocratic leader that China has had in the last 30 years. Zhu Rongji, in my opinion, was a true closet Democrat because he never talked about democracy, but if you look at the battery of laws and institutions that were passed under his watch, you can see a very clear march towards this kind of institutional transformation. Today, it's a lot less clear, and I think that because Zhu Rongji and Jiang Zemin also, of course, but because they were much stronger leaders than Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, we're seeing a big backslide in this area. So I think it's a little bit of a nervous time. Now, let me jump into what I think is most important for this group, because I think that it's really important now to kind of frame this in a way that really explores what the issues are with respect to Taiwan. Now, the key issue here for me is that, of course, whenever I end up discussing Taiwan, I'm, again, no expert on Taiwan, but I know the history well enough, and usually have students that don't know the history very well. And so here I think we get into a very interesting kind of landscape of really thinking deeply about what it has been to think about Taiwan as an island just across the Taiwan Strait. Whether it is a sovereign nation, I think is one thing that has, of course, always driven these kinds of discussions. Whether it has ever been, I think, is an interesting thing to really discuss. But more important than this is to really think deeply about whether this political question actually matters today. Because today, make no mistake about it, there are about 1.1 million people from Taiwan, about 5% of the population, living on the eastern seaboard in China. And several of them, many of them, are some of the wealthiest business people in Taiwan. And so I think if you look at this transformation and the ways in which China opens its doors to Taiwan right after the Tiananmen massacre, you see this very dramatic transformation that has basically made it the case that the wealthiest elite within Taiwan have a much different set of economic interests than they did prior to 1990.